At 71, Grover Ellsworth believed that a mother who gives her children everything will always have a place at their table. She learned otherwise on a Tuesday, over chicken salad, in the back room of a restaurant her daughter had chosen because it had cloth napkins. Marlene slid a single sheet of paper across the table, turned so the signature line faced her mother. "It's just a family agreement," she said kindly, the way you'd explain a thing to a child. "Mom keeps her clothes. The rest is ours now." Then she offered Grover the guest room until they could get the house sorted. But there was one thing her children never bothered to count: a cold stone tower on a bluff 3 hours north, where Lake Erie worked at the rock and never once got tired. Before this was finished, that tower would hand back every acre they took, in a voice not one of them ever expected to hear again. Grover did not know that yet. She folded her hands in her lap, the way she always did, and she waited. That stillness was an old habit. People who did not know her read it as surrender. They were wrong about that, and they tended to find out late. The lunch was supposed to be about her husband. Raymond Coyle had been in the ground 11 days. 48 years she had been married to him, long enough that she still reached across the cold side of the bed at night for a man who was not there. That morning, the family lawyer, a tired man named Renner, had read the will aloud in his office on 3rd Street. It was a short will and a simple one. Raymond left everything to Grover, the way the two of them had always agreed: the house and the 80 acres and the old contracting yard behind it. Then everyone drove to lunch, and that was where the second sheet of paper came out, the one Renner had not written. Marlene had typed it herself. She called it the family agreement. What it did, in 3 clean paragraphs, was move the house and the 80 acres and the yard out of Grover's name and into a trust controlled by her 2 children. Grover read it twice. The print was very small. "You'll be taken care of," Marlene said. "That's the whole point. You're 71, Mom. You shouldn't be worrying about property taxes and a furnace. Dale and I will handle all of that now. Your father left it to me," Grover said. "And you're leaving it to us anyway. We're just doing it now while it's tidy." Marlene smoothed the napkin in her lap. "This protects the family. That's all this is. You know the kind of daughter, the one who can say the word family the way other people say collateral and never hear the difference." Dale sat at the end of the table looking out the window at the parking lot. He was the younger one, 44, and he had perfected a way of being present without being involved. "It's the smart move, Mom," he said to the glass. "Don't make it a thing." He did not want the house. He wanted his share turned into cash, and he wanted it before Christmas, and he had already spent some of it in his head. There were 3 grandchildren at that lunch, and 2 of them were old enough to sign. Marlene needed witnesses, and she had brought her own. She tapped the bottom of the page with one manicured nail. "Cody. Honey, right there." Her son was 17. He signed where his mother pointed without reading a word of it, his pen squeaking, his eyes on his phone. Then his sister signed under him. They were witnessing their grandmother sign away the only home any of them had ever eaten Thanksgiving in, and to them it was a permission slip. Grover looked at the little brass key she wore on a bootlace under her collar. She had taken it out without meaning to, the way other women touch a cross. It was small and worn smooth, and it opened a lock 3 hours away. "What is that, even?" Marlene said, not really asking. "You've worn that ratty little thing my whole life. It's a trinket, Mom. It doesn't go to anything." She gave a small laugh and looked at Dale. "Honestly, a man's name and a man's key. Grover. Who names a girl Grover? A name for a woman who never could let one single thing go." Grover tucked the key back under her collar. Then she picked up the pen because the alternative was a scene in a restaurant with cloth napkins, and she had spent 71 years not being the woman who made the scene. She signed her name in her small, even hand. Marlene exhaled and reached across and patted her mother's wrist twice, the way you'd thank a clerk. To understand why she signed, you have to understand where she came from and what she had spent 40 years trying to outrun. The house was on Huffman Avenue in the street, Ann's Hill part of Dayton, a narrow brick place with green shutters and a porch swing that talked to itself in the Miami Valley humidity. Grover had raised both her children inside those walls. 40 years she had been the one who stayed up with the fevers, who sewed the costumes at midnight, who drove to the school when no one else could be reached. She co-signed Dale's first truck. She put the deposit on Marlene's wedding hall and never once mentioned it again. When the contracting yard out back went quiet some winters, it was Grover's tin in the cupboard that covered the gap. She had given them everything a mother has to give, which is to say she had given them the years she would never get back. And she had thought that was the same as buying a seat. She had thought that because of her own mother. Grover was named for her grandfather, Grover Ellsworth, who had kept a light. Out at Marblehead on Lake Erie, there's a stubby fieldstone tower on a bluff, the Ellsworth light, and 3 generations of her family had climbed those stairs in the dark to keep a flame fed so that men in boats could find their way home. Her mother, Iola Ellsworth, was the last true keeper. Iola could wind the clockwork that turned the great glass lens. She could splice a snapped line, read weather off the color of the water, and climb 112 iron steps with a lamp in one hand and her skirts in the other. She kept that light for 31 years, and the family treated her like a hired woman. Grover had watched it her whole childhood. At weddings and funerals and every decision that mattered, the relatives spoke over Iola, around her, about her. "Oh, that's just the Lighthouse woman," they'd say, as if a woman who held back the dark for the whole county were a quaint local fixture, like a weather vane. They left her off the deeds. They left her out of the room. Iola used to sign her letters with a line that little Grover never understood. 3 words at the bottom in her sloped hand: "Keep the light fed." Grover thought it was just something keepers said. She swore, standing at her mother's grave at 19, that no child of hers would ever feel the way she had watched her mother feel. Unwanted, set to one side, a guest at her own family. So she gave, and she gave, and she gave, for 40 years, and she told herself that love poured out like that could never come back empty. Now here she sat in a back room with cloth napkins, being offered the guest room. There is a particular arithmetic the betrayed always do too late. Grover did it that week, alone in the brick house, and the numbers did not come out the way Marlene's paper said. She knew her daughter, and she had been watching her daughter's husband for 2 years. The Pruitt Contracting Company had not pulled a building permit since the spring. Their trucks sat in a row out on the lot, washed and idle, like men dressed for a job that wasn't coming. The sign had been freshly painted, which is the first thing a sinking business does, paint the sign. And there was the letter. Grover had ridden in Marlene's car to the cemetery, and on the dash, half tucked under a designer sunglasses case, was a certified envelope from the bank, the green slip still stapled to it. She'd only seen the heading, Notice of Default. She'd said nothing, but she understood then, with a cold and total clarity, what the family agreement was really for. Marlene had already pledged the Ellsworth land against her husband's debt. The 80 acres her father left, her mother were standing as collateral for a contracting firm, 2 payments from the end. The bank was going to call the note, and Marlene needed the estate sold and turned to cash before they did, or the Pruitts lost everything. That was the secret under all the kind words about furnaces and property taxes. Not love, not even greed exactly. Fear, wearing love's coat to dinner. It moved fast after that, the way these things do once the paper is signed. Within 3 weeks, the house on Huffman Avenue had a sign in the yard and a lockbox on the door. The 80 acres went to a developer out of Cincinnati who wanted to put up 40 units and call them the Reserve at Ellsworth Farm, which was the only time any of them ever bothered to use the family name. Dale got his cash. Marlene took the lockbox key off the realtor and never offered her mother a copy. The guest room offer quietly expired, the way such offers do, with no one ever saying the word no. Grover packed one bag. She had decided that herself, and there was something almost peaceful in the deciding. One canvas bag, the kind Raymond used to carry his thermos in. Into it went 4 changes of clothes, her mother's letters in a rubber band, a flashlight, and a framed photograph of Iola standing at the foot of the tower with her hand on the door. She left the dishes. She left the porch swing. She left the spare bedroom they were already calling theirs. There was exactly one thing in the whole world they had not bothered to take, because not one of them had ever once thought it was worth anything. A cold stone tower on a bluff 3 hours north with 112 iron steps and a locked room at the top of them, kept current on its taxes, by some account no one in the family could explain. The deed was a tangle nobody wanted to untangle, so they left it. They left their mother the lighthouse, the way you leave a dog the bone you don't want, and they felt generous doing it. Grover put the canvas bag on the passenger seat of Raymond's old truck. She backed out of the driveway on Huffman Avenue for the last time and did not look at the house. She drove north out of Dayton, up through the flat green middle of Ohio. 3 hours until the land ran out and the water began and the air turned to cold iron and lake. It was past dark when she came over the last rise at Marblehead. The tower stood black against a blacker sky, the way it had stood her whole life. No light turned in the glass. No keeper had climbed those stairs in years, but the small brass key was warm against her collarbone, and Grover Ellsworth had come home. The keeper's cottage had a light in the window. Grover sat in the truck a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, and she looked at that small yellow square of glass and could not make it agree with anything she knew. The family had always spoken of the Ellsworth light as abandoned, a ruin out on a rock, a tax bill nobody could explain. Dale called it the pile of stones. Marlene called it nothing at all, which was worse. And yet here was a lamp burning warm behind a curtain, the way a lamp burns in a house where somebody lives, where somebody has lived a long time and means to go on living. She took her canvas bag and walked up the shell path in the cold, and the lake breathed on her out of the dark, big and slow and close. The smell of cold iron and wet stone she had not let herself remember in 40 years. The door opened before she reached it. A woman stood in the light of it, small and straight-backed and old, with white hair pinned up and a man's wool cardigan buttoned to the throat. She held a kerosene lamp at shoulder height, the way a person holds a lamp who has held one her whole life, and she looked at Grover for a long moment without alarm, the way you look at weather you have been expecting. "You'll be Iola's girl," the woman said. "You have her hands. You've been standing out there in the cold looking up at the tower like she used to. Come in before the lake takes the warmth right off you." Her name was Edna, and she had lived in the keeper's cottage for 19 years. She set Grover at a scrubbed pine table and put the kettle on without asking, and that was the first kindness Grover had been handed by another living soul since the men lowered Raymond into the ground. It undid something in her chest that the betrayal had wound very tight. She had to look hard at the tablecloth for a moment to keep her face in order. "You're wondering how I come to be here," Edna said, setting down 2 cups. "Everybody does, the rare time anybody asks. My Harold ran the supply boat out to the islands 30 years, and when he passed, there wasn't a thing left but debt and a leaky skiff. I had nowhere. And one morning a letter come from a trust office in Sandusky saying a place had been kept for me here. Rent paid, heat paid, for as long as I drew breath, because Iola Ellsworth arranged it before she died. I never asked her to. I'd met the woman maybe 4 times. She just somehow knew I'd need it and set it down on paper years before I did." Edna poured the tea. "That was your mother. She provided for folks quiet the way other people gossip. Half this point owes her something it never got the chance to thank her for." Grover held the warm cup in both hands. "They told me she died with nothing," she said. "The family. They always said she was poor as a wren. Did they?" Edna's mouth tightened, just slightly. People who can't imagine giving a thing away can't imagine a person who could. They call it nothing because they can't find it in a bank. She nodded toward the back of the cottage, where a narrow hall ran off into shadow. "There's a room back there been locked the whole 19 years I've been under this roof. Oak door, iron lock, no key in any drawer I ever turned out. The trust man said it wasn't mine to open and wasn't his either, and that one day the right person would come with the right key, and I wasn't to worry myself about it before then." She looked at the little brass key resting against Grover's collarbone, and she did not say anything about it at all. She only refilled the cup that was already full, the way the kind do when they have said enough. "You have probably already guessed what was behind that oak door. You have not all of it. In the morning, the wind had laid down and the lake was the flat gray of a dropped knife, and a man came up the shell path with a ring of keys the size of a donut hanging off his belt. He was past 60 himself, broad and weathered, with hands so scarred and thick they looked carved. And he stopped when he saw Grover come out onto the cottage step, and he took off his cap. 'I'm Hollis Tarr,' he said. 'I keep up the tower for the Maritime Society. Have done since your mother got too old for the stairs.' He studied her face the way Edna had, looking for Iola in it, and finding her. 'I knew you the second I saw you. She kept your picture in the watchroom. Little girl on the gallery rail with her braids flying straight out sideways in the gale. She used to tap it with one finger and say, 'That one. That one has the eyes for it.' Grover had not known that. She had not known her mother kept a picture of her anywhere at all. She had spent 40 years believing she was the daughter who left, who married a contractor and moved down to the flat middle of the state and let the light go dark behind her. To hear that her mother had pointed at her likeness and said, 'That one,' in a tower 3 hours from any table Grover ever set, was a thing she had to take in carefully, in small breaths, like cold water. Hollis went into the cottage and came back with a book. It was bound in cracked black leather and swollen with damp and tied shut with a length of tarred twine, and he set it in her 2 hands as carefully as you would hand across a sleeping child. 'This is the keeper's log,' he said. 'Goes back past your grandfather. Every gale, every ship that come too close, every night the lamp was lit, and who lit it? Your mother wrote in it to the last week of her life.' He paused, and he looked at her steady, and what he said next, he said plainly, with no kindness wrapped around it to make it go down easier, because he was not a man who had come to rescue her, and he wanted that understood. 'I'll tell you a thing the Society's lawyer told me, and you can do with it what you want. Iola Ellsworth was the registered keeper of this light on the federal rolls and the county's both. The day she died, that title and the parcel it sits on don't pass to anybody by a handshake. They surely don't pass by a luncheon. Whatever paper your people had you sign down in Dayton, it had nothing on it about this rock. They couldn't sign away what was never theirs, and what was never your husband's to leave.' Grover stood with the cold book in her hands and the cold lake at her back, and for the first time in 11 days, the stone she had been carrying behind her ribs shifted just enough to let one clean breath under it. 'You're not telling me this to save me,' she said. 'No, ma'am.' Hollis put his cap back on. Iola didn't keep this light 50 years so her daughter could be saved by an old locksmith. I'm telling you because it's true, and because the stairs are still there, and a keeper's daughter ought to know what's hers before she decides what to do about it." He nodded once at the tower. "Lamp's been dark 4 years. Society pays me to keep the damp off the brass and chase the gulls out, nothing more. Nobody's wound the carriage since your mother's hands. If you want up there, the door's open. Mind the 7th step from the top, it's rotted through. Your mother knew to skip it. You'll have to learn it new." He left her the ring of keys and walked back down the path, and he did not look back. And Grover understood that this, too, was a kind of respect, the kind that does not hover. She opened the log right there on the cottage step. Iola's hand ran down the brittle pages, small and sloped and even, the same hand the daughter had inherited without ever being taught it. Wind so west, hard, lit at 4. The marquette stood off the shoal, and I held her steady till dawn. and at the bottom of every page, the same 3 words Grover had read on the bottom of every letter her whole life and never once understood. Keep the light fed. She had always thought it was a saying, a keeper's blessing, the way another woman might write, "God keep you." Standing on the step with the lake going on and on behind her, she let herself wonder, for the first time, whether her mother had meant it as an instruction. Whether somewhere there was a thing that did the feeding, and a thing that got fed, and a daughter who had finally come close enough to find out. She put the log under her arm, and she went to the tower. The door at the base was iron, and it groaned like something waking. Inside, the cold was older than the cold outside, a stone cold that had been holding still in the dark for a century, and the air smelled of brass polish gone to verdigris and the faint sweet rot of old whale oil soaked into the very rock. A staircase of black iron spiraled up out of sight, treads worn to a shine, down their middle, where 3 generations of her family had set their feet in exactly the same place 10,000 times. 112 steps. Grover was 71 years old, and she had buried her husband 11 days before and signed away her house to her own child, and she put her hand on the cold rail and she began to climb. She did not hurry. She had learned a long time ago that the women in her family did not get to the top of anything by hurrying. They got there by not stopping. She counted under her breath, the way Iola must have counted, the way the first Grover Ellsworth must have counted with a whale oil lamp in his fist. And when she came to the 7th step from the top, she felt the soft give of the rotted board under her shoe, and she stepped over it without looking down. And only after 2 steps higher did she realize her body had known to do that the knowledge had been waiting in her legs for 40 years for the stairs to ask. The lamp room caught the morning and threw it everywhere. That was the thing no one who had not stood in one could be told. The great glass stood in the center of the round room, nearly as tall as she was, a beehive of curved prisms ringed one above the other, a Fresnel lens cut and ground 140 years ago by men who would never see this lake. And even dark, even filmed with 4 years of dust and gull soil, it took the plain gray daylight and bent it and multiplied it until the whole room swam with broken rainbows. Grover stood in the doorway with her dead mother's logbook under her arm, and she wept. Finally, the way she had not let herself weep at the graveside or the luncheon or the lawyer's office on 3rd Street, standing in the cold, colored light her family had been keeping back the dark with since before any of them had a name. Then she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, because crying does not wind a clock, and she went to work. The lens turned on a carriage, a heavy brass mechanism of cogs, and a great coiled spring, driven the way a grandfather clock is driven, by a weight that descends and a spring that must be wound. It was seized stiff with old grease gone to glue and the cold of 4 winters. Grover crouched at the base of it and found the winding socket, a square brass hole green at the edges, and she reached up under her collar and drew out the little brass key on its bootlace, the trinket her daughter had laughed at across the cloth napkins, the man's key for a woman who could not let one single thing go. It slid into the socket as though the socket had been cut for it, because of course it had. She set both hands to it and she leaned her whole weight, and for a long moment nothing moved and her old shoulders burned. And then somewhere deep in the brass, something let go with a groan and a clack. And the carriage gave a 1/4 inch, and then an inch, and then the great lens shuddered and began, slow as a tide, to turn. And as it came around, the morning light raking through all those ranked prisms swept once across the inner wall of the lamp room, across the brass housing that cradled the lens at its back, and in that traveling blade of light, Grover saw for half a second a seam in the metal that did not belong, a panel. A square of housing set a shade proud of the rest, its edges sealed with a line of old solder gone the soft salt green of weathered copper. Something had been closed up behind her mother's lens, and the carriage that hid it would only turn for the key around her neck. She knelt there in the wheeling colored light, with her heart going hard, and she did not pry at it yet. A keeper learns the light first and asks her question second, but she put one finger to the green seam, the way Edna had touched the locked oak door, the way Grover herself touched the brass key in moments of fear, and she said aloud to the empty turning room, to her mother, to the lake that never once got tired, the only thing there was to say. "All right," she said, "I'm here. Show me." She did not pry at it that first day, and that restraint was the keeper in her, the very thing her children had spent 40 years mistaking for weakness. A keeper learns the light first, and then the light shows her where the questions are kept. So she wound the carriage out to its full travel and watched the great lens turn its slow and patient circle the way it had been ground to turn 140 years before, and she worked oil into the cogs that would take it and coaxed loose the ones that had seized in the cold, and she wiped 4 winters of dust and gull soil from the prisms with a rag until the brass ran clean and the glass threw its broken rainbows true across the round stone walls. Only when the light was a working light again did she let herself go back to the seam. She came up the next morning with a stub of candle, a flat blade Hollis tar kept in the watchroom for scraping verdigris, and the patience of a woman who has nothing left to lose and so cannot be hurried. She knelt at the back of the housing where the panel sat a shade proud of the brass around it, and she warmed the old solder with the candle, the way her mother would have warmed it, close and slow, never pushing the metal past what it would give. It took the better part of an hour. She did not mind the hour. She had nothing now but hours, and this was the first one in 11 days she had wanted to be inside of. The panel came away in her hand with a small sound like a held breath let go. Behind it, in a cavity cut into the brass no bigger than a bread box, sat a tin. It had been copper once, she could see that, but 60 years of Lake Erie had taken it over entirely and turned it the soft furred green of a coin pulled up out of a fountain, the exact salt green of the seam that had first caught her eye, so that the tin and the panel that hid it had aged into the same forgotten color. She lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Something inside shifted, flat and circular, with the particular settled weight of a thing that has been waiting a long time to be carried back down into the world. She did not open it on the gallery because the wind was up off the lake, and she would not let the wind have whatever her mother had hidden from the wind. She carried the tin down the 112 steps with both arms around it like a foundling, stepping over the 7th from the top without having to think about it now, and she set it on the scrubbed pine table in the cottage, where Edna had set the tea the night before. Inside, packed in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, were 2 things. The first was a reel of tape, narrow brown ribbon wound on a metal spool, the kind that had run on the big machines when Grover was a girl, with a paper band around it and her mother's small, sloped hand on the band. The second was a key, not a winding key, not the twin of the little brass one, warm at her throat. This was an iron door key, long and black and plain and tied to its bow with the same tarred twine that bound the logbook was a scrap of card, and on the card, in the hand Grover had inherited and never once been taught, 4 words, "For the one who climbs." Edna looked at the iron key a long moment, and then she looked down the dark, narrow hall toward the oak door that had stood locked the whole 19 years she had lived under that roof, and she said nothing at all, because some doors a person ought to be let to open in her own time. Grover did not open it that day either. She had learned a thing her children never would, which is that a thing held back is not a thing lost, and she wanted to understand what she was holding before she went looking for what it unlocked. So she put the iron key in her coat pocket and the reel back in its oilcloth, and she asked Edna where on the point a person might still find a machine old enough to play it. That was how she came to meet Reuben. He was 19, a ferry hand on the boat that ran out to the islands, with big raw hands and a way of not quite meeting your eye that Grover knew on sight, because she had raised a son who did the very same, and she knew it for shyness and not for guile. Edna sent her down to the ferry dock at Marblehead, because Reuben, she said, was the only soul on the point under 60 who understood old machinery, having more or less raised himself on it. Grover found him in the ferry shed with a marine engine in pieces around him, every part laid out on clean rags in the order it had come apart. And when she told him what she had and what she needed, his whole shy face changed. "Ellsworth," he said. "Careful. The way a man sets down something he is afraid of breaking. You're the Light's people." And then, before she could answer, "Quieter. Your mother paid my schooling." Grover said she did not understand, so Reuben told her, in the flat, plain way of a boy who has told a thing to himself 100 times and never once out loud, how when he was small there had been no money and less than no future, a father gone off, a mother working 2 jobs over on the mainland, and how a letter had come from a trust office in Sandusky the autumn he turned 14, saying his tuition at the Maritime School in Toledo was provided, books and board and the whole of it, for as long as he kept his marks up, at the request of Iola Ellsworth, who had heard that the ferry boy down at Marblehead had a hand for engines and no way in the world to feed it. "I met her twice," Reuben said. "She came down to this dock both times and watched me work and didn't say but about 10 words. The second time she put her hand on the gunwale and she said, 'You keep the light fed, son.' I thought she meant the lighthouse. I never knew what she meant." He wiped his hands slow on a rag. "I'm at the top of my class. I'd have been pulling traps with my uncle and counting myself lucky. She never let me thank her. She was gone before I finished my first year." Grover sat down on an overturned crate in the ferry shed, and she thought of her mother dismissed her whole life as just the lighthouse woman, talked over and around and past, left off every family decision the way a draft is left out of a warm room, and she understood, sitting there in the smell of diesel and lake water, that all the while Iola had been keeping a second set of books no family luncheon had ever been let to see, providing in the dark and the quiet for ferry boys and widows and a daughter 3 hours to the south, the way the Light itself provided, asking nothing back, only that it be kept fed. Reuben found her a machine. There was a reel-to-reel recorder in the back of the Maritime Society's little museum, taken in years before with a box of donated gear, and it still had its cord and its spools, but the rubber that once turned the works had perished to crumbs. He could machine a new wheel given a day, he said, but the part that drove the whole thing had to be turned by hand, by a crank fitting he did not have, a square brass socket gone green at the edges where a winder had once gone. Grover reached up under her collar and drew out the little brass key on its bootlace, the trinket her own daughter had laughed at across the cloth napkins, and she held it next to the socket. The same square, the same green, cut by the same hand for the same reason. Her mother had built the lock and the key to answer each other across 60 years and 3 hours of road, so that the light and the voice could only ever be wound by the same hands, the keeper's hands, the hands she had pointed to in a photograph on the gallery rail and said, "That one." "That'll drive it," Reuben said softly, looking at the key and then at Grover, and he did not laugh. But before she let herself hope on a thing she had not yet heard, Grover did the other work a keeper does, which is to read the record before she trusts the Light. Hollis Tarr's words were still in her ears, that her mother was the registered keeper the day she died, that no title passed by a luncheon, and she meant to know exactly what stood on the public books. Reuben drove her in the ferry company truck to the county recorder's office over in Port Clinton, and Grover sat at a scarred oak counter with a clerk young enough to be her granddaughter and asked to see everything filed against the Ellsworth name and the Lighthouse parcel, both. What she found there turned the cold stone behind her ribs clean over, the bluff, the fieldstone tower and the ground it stood on, the rock her children had waved off as a tax bill nobody could explain. It had never been in Raymond's estate at all. It had never once been the family's to gather up and split over a luncheon. It had been deeded, the better part of 30 years back, into a thing called the Ellsworth Light Preservation Trust, raised up quietly by Iola with a lawyer in Sandusky, and the trust had paid the taxes on that parcel every single year since, on time and in full, out of an endowment Grover now understood her mother had been feeding dollar by frugal dollar her whole life. Keep the light fed. It had never been a blessing scrawled at the bottom of a letter. It had been a ledger. And then the clerk, helpful, turning the screen, showed her the recent thing, and the floor seemed to tilt under her feet. There was a lien filed not 2 months gone. A contracting firm in Dayton, her son-in-law's firm, the one Marlene had married into and worried over at the supper table for years, had pledged the Ellsworth farmland, and the filing read in its plain machine type, the appurtenant lake parcel, against a loan it could no longer carry. Marlene had signed it. Marlene had pledged the bluff. Marlene had borrowed against a piece of ground that had not belonged to the family for 30 years, that had never in this world been hers or Raymond's or anyone's to pledge, to hold off a thing she had hidden from all of them behind the soft word stewardship. Grover sat very still at the counter, her folded hands quiet on the wood the way they had been quiet at the luncheon, and she let the whole shape of it come together. Her daughter had not voted her out of her own house on Huffman Avenue out of plain spite. Marlene had sold a thing she did not own because she was drowning, and she had called the drowning protecting the family, and she had set her own mother in the guest room to do it. The cruelty had a reason living under it after all, and the reason did not make it any smaller. It made it sadder, and it made it worse. And it put a thing into Grover's quiet hands she had not had at any table in 40 years. Whose name, she thought, is really on that loan? And what becomes of it the day the bank learns what they pledged? She had what she needed now to ask her questions. But there was one door left. That evening she carried the iron key with its 4 words down the dark, narrow hall to the oak door that had stood locked 19 years. And Edna stood back with her lamp and let her go to it alone. The key turned hard and then easy, the way a lock turns when the right hand has finally found it, and the door swung in on a small, dry room that smelled of cedar and old paper and the faint sweetness of a place that has waited a long time without one word of complaint. There was a chair and a table and a steel cabinet, and on the table, set out square and ready as though her mother had laid it down that very morning and only stepped out for tea, was a reel-to-reel recorder, older than the one in the museum, oiled, covered against the damp, with a square brass socket gone green at the edges. This was the machine Iola had meant to be used, kept all these years for the one who would climb. In the cabinet, in folders labeled in the small, sloped hand, was everything. The deed to the bluff, the notarized trust, signed and sealed and dated before Marlene was old enough to marry, before Dale was old enough to drive, before any of them had grown into the people who would one day slide a paper across a table and say the rest is ours now. Tax receipts going back 30 years, every one of them stamped paid, and clipped to the front of the trust, in an envelope gone yellow at the edges, a single sheet in Iola's hand that Grover read standing up once, and then lowered herself into the waiting chair and read again. She did not tell you what was written on that page. Not yet. She folded it back into its envelope, and she set it with the deed and the reel and the little brass key, and she sat a long while in her mother's dry cedar room, with all of it gathered in her lap. A woman who had arrived 11 days ago, with nothing she had been allowed to keep but her clothes. Then Grover Ellsworth, who had not raised her voice in 40 years and did not mean to begin now, went out to the front room and picked up Edna's telephone and dialed the number of the house on Huffman Avenue that used to be hers. And when her daughter answered, she said, in the low and even voice they had always taken for surrender, that she had found something up north that concerned the whole family, that the both of them ought to drive up and see it for themselves, and that she would have the tea on when they came. They came up on a gray Thursday in Marlene's husband's good car, down the gravel track that ran out along the point with the lake flat and pewter on both sides of it, and Grover watched them come from the cottage window with her hands quiet in her lap. She had the kettle already on. She had set 3 of Edna's good cups out on the scrubbed pine table, the ones with the faded cornflowers, and she had laid the papers face down beside them in the order she meant to turn them over, the way her mother had laid the parts of an engine out on a clean rag so that nothing would be lost and nothing would be hurried. Edna had taken her knitting up the road to Hollis Tar's for the afternoon. Reuben was down at the dock with the company truck, waiting on a telephone call that would tell him when to bring it up. Grover had thought of everything, the way a keeper thinks of everything, because the lake does not forgive a thing forgotten. Marlene came in without knocking, the way a person comes into a place she has already decided belongs to her, and she stood in the low doorway taking in the bare stone and the oil lamp and the smell of cold water in the curtains, and her mouth did the small tightening Grover had watched it do across 40 years of suppers. "Mother," she said, "look at this. Look at where you have put yourself." Dale came in behind her with his hands buried in his coat and his eyes going everywhere but to his mother's face, a big, soft man of 44 who had looked away from hard things his whole life and was looking away now. "We have been worried sick," Marlene said, in the warm, reasonable voice she kept for the things that were neither. "Out here playing keeper at your age. It is not dignified. We came to bring you home and get you settled somewhere sensible, somewhere with people to mind you." She pulled out a chair without being asked and sat. "I hope you have had time up here to think about being reasonable." Grover rose and poured the tea. She filled Marlene's cup first, and then Dale's, and last her own, and she set the kettle back on its iron trivet and sat down across from the 2 of them with her spine straight and her hands settling into her lap. "Drink it while it is hot," she said, even and low, the level voice they had carried out of every argument she'd ever lost on purpose. "I asked you up because there is something here that belongs to all of us, and I wanted you to see it in the place where it lives." Marlene's shoulders came down half an inch. She believed, Grover could see her believing it, that the old woman had run out of road up here on the rock and was going to hand it all back across the cornflower cups. Marlene lifted her tea. "I am glad you are being sensible," she said. Then Grover turned over the first paper. It was the keeper's logbook, the tarred twine still around it, and she opened it to the last page her mother's hand had ever filled and turned it so the 2 of them could read the date. "This is the light's record," Grover said. "Hollis Tar keeps it now, but he let me hold it. Your grandmother, Iola Ellsworth, was the registered keeper of this station the morning she died, not the family's keeper, the state's. A title like that does not pass around a luncheon table on a paper anybody signs. It passes the way the law says it passes, and the law has not the first thing to do with what the 3 of us signed in that dining room." Marlene's eyes moved over the page, quick, the way they moved over a contract. "That is a county matter," she said. "That is nothing." "By itself," Grover agreed, "it is very nearly nothing." And she turned over the second paper. This one took Marlene longer, and Grover watched her come to it. It was the deed to the bluff and the tower and the ground they sat on, and clipped behind it the notarized trust, the Ellsworth Light Preservation Trust, raised up in Sandusky and signed and sealed before Marlene was old enough to marry into the Pruitt name and the Pruitt debt. "This ground was never your father's," Grover said. "It was never in Raymond's estate. It was never the family's to gather up and divide. 30 years ago, your grandmother deeded it into this trust, and the trust has paid the tax on it every year since. Out of money she set aside in small, frugal sums her whole life, while the rest of you called her the woman with the pointless old hobby. She let that sit a moment. You sold the farmland. That was yours to sell, and you sold it, and I have made my peace with the house on Huffman Avenue. But you did not stop at the farmland, and she turned over the third paper. It was the filing from the recorder's office in Port Clinton, the machine type plain and gray under the lamp, and Grover laid one finger beneath the line that mattered and left it there. 2 months ago, your husband's firm pledged the Ellsworth farmland against a loan it could no longer carry, and it did not pledge the farmland alone. It pledged the lake parcel. This rock under our feet. She lifted her finger. And here is the name on the pledge. Not the firm's lawyer, not your husband, yours. You signed it, Marlene? You borrowed against a piece of the earth that has not belonged to this family for 30 years, that was never yours or your father's or mine to promise any bank, and you did it to hold off a thing you have been calling at every supper for years, protecting the family. Dale's cup had stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down very carefully as though a sound might break something, and he looked at his sister, and then he did the thing he always did and looked away. You knew, he said to her, low. You knew when you slid that paper at her. You needed it all sold before the bank looked close. Marlene said nothing. Her face had gone the color of the lake. Grover stood. She went down the dark, narrow hall to the cedar room, the room that had stood locked the whole 19 years Edna had lived under that roof, the room Marlene had asked 3 caretakers for a key to and never once been given, and she came back carrying the older machine her mother had left covered against the damp, set ready on its table for the one who would come. She set it on the pine boards between the cups. She lifted the reel from its stiff oilcloth, the narrow brown ribbon her mother had wound when Grover herself was a girl, and she threaded it through the heads with the steady hands of a woman who had spliced tape before either of these two was born. Then she reached up under her collar and drew out the small brass key she had worn at her throat all these years, the trinket Marlene had laughed at across the folded napkins and called a man's old junk, and she fitted its square green head into the square green socket that drove the works. They answered each other the way they had been cut to answer, 60 years apart by the same hand. Marlene watched the key go in, and Grover saw the laugh of that luncheon die in her daughter's throat. Perhaps you have already guessed whose name that reel would speak. It is the part that came after the name that no one in the room was ready to carry. Grover wound the key, and the spools began to turn, and out of the worn ribbon and the little brass horn of the speaker came a voice none of them had heard in the better part of 9 years, Iola Ellsworth, thin with the years and the tape, and steady as a tide. She gave the date first, plain, a date from before Marlene could drive and before Dale was born at all. She gave her own name and said she was of sound mind, and then, slow, in the cottage where she had spoken it into the machine alone one winter, with the lake working at the stones, she named her heir. She left the light and the bluff and the ground and the whole of the trust that fed it to her daughter Grover, the one she had taught to climb, sole and entire. And the old voice did not stop where a will stops. It went on, gentle and certain, into the part Iola had made for exactly this room. If you are hearing this, her mother said, then someone has tried to make my girl into a stranger at her own family's table. I knew that they might. I watched them learn it young. A pause, the tape hissing soft. So if they ever sit her in the guest room and call it kindness, you play them this. She was never the one left out. She was always the one I chose. The spools turned on into blank tape, and the little horn hissed, and nobody in the cottage moved. Grover reached over and stilled the reel with one finger. The lake went on against the rocks outside, patient, the only sound left in the world. Marlene was crying without any noise at all, the tears just standing and falling, her hands flat on the cornflower cloth, and for one long breath she was a small girl again at this woman's knee, and Grover felt the whole old pull of 40 years to get up and go around the table and gather her in. She did not get up. She had gotten up 10,000 times. She sat with her hands folded and let the silence do what silence does. There was a letter with the deed, Grover said at last. 4 words were tied to the iron key that opened her room, and they were about climbing. And I will tell you that I am the only one of the 3 of us who has ever climbed anything in her life. Your grandmother did not hand me this because I was born first or loved best. She hid it behind a lens at the top of a tower, behind a panel soldered shut, where the only soul who would ever reach it was the one who could wind a carriage in the dark and read a lamp and was willing to make the climb. She built the lock so that only a keeper could open it, and not one of you ever once asked to learn. She turned the letter face up. It was short. Her mother had written that she had spent a life talked over and passed and around, left standing outside every choice the family ever made, and that she had sworn the one who came after her would have it in a voice she could not argue with that she was wanted. I could not put it right for myself, the letter ended. I could put it right for you. Climb, and it is yours. Marlene wiped her face. Mother, she said, and the reasonable voice was gone, and what stood under it was only fear. If this goes to the county, the firm is finished. We are finished. I know what you signed, Grover said. I read it before you did. She lifted the pot and poured the last of it into Marlene's cup, steady, a hostess to the end. I am not going to scream at you. I have never once raised my voice in this family. But I am not going to sit in a guest room and call it kindness, and I am not going to lie to a bank to spare you the bed you made. You may finish your tea. Then you should drive home and tell your husband the truth, because it is going to find him whether you say it or not. They drove off down the point a little after 4, and the thing was already moving and could not be called back. Because the parcel had never belonged to the estate, the pledge Marlene had signed was a promise made on ground she did not own, and nothing built on it would stand. Within the month, the bank, learning at last what it truly held, called the whole of the note. A clerk in the recorder's office at Port Clinton drew a line through the conveyance and stamped a single word across the parcel, where Marlene's signature had stood, and the word was void. A letter of inquiry went out from the county on the question of how a woman had come to pledge land that 30 years of public record said was never hers. None of it happened with a raised voice. It happened the way the law happens, in stamps and registered mail and a line drawn clean through a name. That winter, alone in the cedar room with the lake working at the stones, Grover Ellsworth set a fresh reel on the older machine and wound the brass key into its socket and recorded a voice of her own, naming what she had been given and what it was for, telling whoever climbed after her that they had not been left out but chosen by the climb itself. And then she sealed the reel in a new tin behind the lens and soldered the panel down over it, coaxing the old metal with the candle, asking and never forcing, and she taught the boy. All that spring, Reuben came up from the dock when the ferry was tied off, and she stood at his shoulder in the watch room and showed him the cogs that took the oil and the cogs that wanted leaving alone, how to read the lamp and splice a tape without snapping 60 years off the spool, and the ferry boy, who had been going to spend his life pulling traps, became the next keeper of the Ellsworth light. On a long blue evening at the end of May, she went up the iron stairs alone, the brass key warm at her throat, and she wound the carriage by hand and set the flame to the wick and stood back as the great lens woke and threw its turning beam out, flat across the dark and moving water, sweep after steady sweep. Below her on the stairs, she heard Reuben's slow boots coming up to learn the work. The light stays on.